So I thought we might start with the basics and talking about why shoes, the traditional shoes that we might be wearing with the lots of cushioning and the heel, elevated heel and the turned up toe and all of that, how that might be causing injury. So let's maybe start with some of the features that
Sure.
like a traditional running shoe might have and why that's injurious to our biomechanics.
Let's take a step back from there and just look at regular fashion shoes, right? And look at what has been sort of the standard configuration of footwear for the last 150 years, which for most people is a raised heel, is a stiletto front, right? A narrow, pointy front in the name of fashion. For some reason, that became a thing, a fashionable thing about 100 years ago, 150 years ago, where the peasantry wore wide boots that allowed their feet to move around as they're supposed to while they were doing manual labor. Meanwhile, the gentry and the upper classes were constricting their feet into these fashionable shoes that had higher heels, elevated heels, narrow toe box coming to a point at the end, which scrunched the big toe against the other toes, confined what we call the metatarsal head, that mid-range part of the forefoot. Okay, so then let's cut to running shoes, which when I first started running in the late 60s and early 70s, there weren't really any running shoes because not many people were runners. It was not a big fad. Certainly wasn't a running boom until years later. In the early days of running, as basically also mostly in the U.S., I ran in Chuck Taylors. I ran in basketball sneakers, and then eventually got some running shoes, which were Onitsuka Tigers, and these were what we would call minimalist shoes today. The sole was very thin, like a 1/4 inch thick, and those were kind of the original running shoes that anybody who self-selected as a runner, in my case, I was too small to play basketball, football, baseball, hockey, any of the sort of traditional U.S. sports. I became a runner just because that was all that was left to me as an ectomorphic youngster who had pretty good lung capacity and a high tolerance for pain. So the origin of running shoes goes back to, or at least these thick padded cushion running shoes that we know today, goes back to Coach Bill Bowerman of the Oregon Track Club and Phil Knight, who was starting up Blue Ribbon Sports, which became Nike. And they were interested in developing a shoe that their very good elite, skinny, ectomorphic runners could wear and run with good form more miles. The early shoes were so thin that it was literally the bottoms of your feet that dictated. It was your shoes that said 40 miles a week, that's enough running for you, pal, or 50 miles or whatever it was. And it wasn't until these guys developed this cushioning and this waffle sole that allowed elite runners to now run 90 miles a week, 100 miles a week, and be better competitive on the world scene. So the origin of the thick cushion running shoe goes back to those days, to Nike. And then that just became this kind of bizarre evolution of thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker shoes, with the assumption being that the more people took on this new fad of running, the more they would benefit from cushioning. So the shoes became thicker, the heel became raised. This was all in the interest of making it easier, in some sense, to put in 20 or 30 or 40 miles a week. If you were a beginner runner, you'd never self-selected to be a runner. Now you read about running in Jim Fixx's book on the Book of Running, or you heard about a friend who was entering a marathon and you said, I got to do that. And over the years, more and more people who should not be running started running. They started running thinking that it was the best thing they could do in terms of overall fitness. They started running thinking it was a good way to lose weight. It wasn't. They started running thinking it was going to be better for their cardiovascular health. Maybe, maybe not. We can get into that later. But with all of these new people coming into the running scene, the running shoe, big shoe, as we call them, started creating these outrageously thick shoes that gave some amount of cushioning. And eventually, so many people were running with bad form, like they were landing on their heels and rotating off the front of their feet. And the shoes, for some reason, allowed people to do this activity and not get injured in real time. Now, what happened was over time, they got injuries further up the kinetic chain. So a thick shoe may feel good when you're putting it on in the running shoe store and you take your 15 jog steps down the aisle and you go, oh my God, these feel like clouds. I'll take them. But then you get out on the roads and you start running and you realize this is forgiving bad form. And Christopher McDougall wrote about this 15 years ago in the book Born to Run. And he acknowledged that running shoes were a source of a lot of problems for a lot of runners. Now, 15 years later, I'm looking at this, looking backwards and going, Christopher McDougall had the right idea, but he didn't take it far enough. And taking it far enough is to suggest that most runners to this day, even with high-tech running shoes, get injured. 50% of all runners get injured every year. At any point in time, like right now, 25% of all people who identify as runners are injured. I mean, that's a higher rate than the NFL. This is not what you want to see in some ideal form of exercise. So the running shoe industry has promoted bad form by creating thicker and thicker and more cushioning in these shoes, and doing so because a lot of people go to their podiatrist and they go, Doc, my feet hurt. I've got these running injuries. I've got Achilles tendon problems. I've got plantar fasciitis. What do I do? And the podiatrist or the orthopedist will say, well, you need thicker shoes. If you want to keep doing this, you're going to need more and more cushioning, and that's not the answer.
Or an orthotic,
which is how so many people have a real short-term fix would be the orthotic. Yeah. But many of these shoes now, because of that industry, have literally built-in orthotics. So you go buy a pair of these shoes, and the arch is already very supported, and it's already kind of throwing your feet in a pronated positioning even before you take your first step.
Yeah. And even if you just look at the architecture, if you just go to your local, your local Nike store, whatever store where they have traditional running shoes, that heel is elevated, right? So if you think about what is going to happen when you're running, it's going to sort of artificially tilt you forward. So it's going to give you the sensation that you have that forward propulsion, right? But in effect, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, but some of the downstream effects of that, of course, that the Achilles is going to get eternally short. I mean, I can't tell you how many women in practice who would come home from like a day of, being in their heels and then go get in their runners and then snap their Achilles. The Achilles becomes short and stiff, you've already said this a little bit, but limits that pronation, limits toe flexion. Like you can't actually use the toes to propel you forward. Like talk a little bit about some of the biomechanical maladaptations that happen in the foot when we're squeezing the toe box, when we're artificially lifting the heel, when we're sort of over supinating or over, protecting against the dreaded pronation. Yep. And that's sort of my little nod to like orthotics or silly. But yeah, tell me a little bit about that. What happens there?
So the first thing with these elevated heels, as you acknowledged, it tilts the entire center of gravity is tilted forward, which isn't necessarily a good thing. You think like maybe you're running with better form, but you're actually not. It's the calf muscle that gets shortened. And by shortening the calf muscle, that puts the strain on the Achilles, which is the strongest tendon in the body, and we absolutely depend on it for walking, for running, for jumping, for sprinting, for dancing, for everything we do. So when you shorten the calf muscle over time, it puts that tension on the Achilles. That can manifest itself, by the way, as plantar fasciitis too. It can reach down to the plantar fascia. Now we've got the elevated heel. Now we've also got this restricted toe box, and I don't care how wide you claim your shoes are, your big toe is still being scrunched against the other toes unnaturally in a position that limits the range of that what we call the great toe, the big toe. Now, in bodybuilding circles and in weightlifting circles, they will acknowledge that in order to engage the gluteus maximus, the butt muscle, you need to involve fully the great toe. In fact, the term is great toe, great ass, which is why a lot of these guys in the gym and girls will take off their shoes on leg days. They'll do squats and deadlifts and lunges either barefoot if the gym will allow it, or in socks, which isn't as good as being barefoot. But at any rate, it's to free up that big toe to abduct, to pull away from and splay outwardly from the rest of the foot. The foot wants to splay outward on every footfall. The natural tendency, if you were to sprint down the beach at low tide and go back and check your footprints, you would see that your foot is at its greatest splay on push-off while you're sprinting down the beach barefoot. The foot wants to do that when you run. Now you've put it into a shoe that's restrictive, that's encasing your toes that's restricting this great toe and just restricting all of the toes from being able to do what they're supposed to do, which is articulate and accommodate the change in texture and surface and so on of the ground that you're running on or walking on. So you combine all of these factors, not the least of which, by the way, one of our advisory board members, Ray McClanahan, I don't know if you know Ray, but he's one of the top running podiatrists in the world, has done a great review of plantar fasciitis and describes a different diagnosis. So many docs who will diagnose plantar fasciitis because people come in, they've been running, they're for some reason that arch area is just so tender and they can't, they try to roll it out with a lacrosse ball, they try to do all of the stim, the electrical stuff, they try to stretch, and none of that works. It's because plantar fasciitis isn't really an itis. It's not as much an inflammation as it is an osis, almost a death of tissue. So plantar fasciosis, if you think about the foot and the fact that this whole area needs circulation, you need to get blood supply to this area. And tendons and ligaments are not really well supplied with blood to begin with. Now, if you cut it off by scrunching the big toe against the rest of the toes in the foot, you've cut off the circulation to that area, to that plantar fascia area. And so that tissue starts to literally die. So one of the cures for plantar fasciosis, misdiagnosis plantar fasciitis, is a lot of barefoot walking, a lot of time allowing that big toe to abduct, or wearing minimalist footwear with very wide toe box that allow, or wearing toe spacers, toe spreaders to allow that circulation to get back in there. At the end of the day, when we look at running shoes, one of the great assumptions is while these shoes are supposedly increasing your leverage and decreasing the amount of strain on your body, they're increasing the amount of strain on your body up the kinetic chain, and we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah.
They're incurring an atrophy within the foot. So your foot muscles, the intrinsic muscles of your feet, all those small muscles of your feet want to work. They want to be moving. The arch needs to be moving. All of the abductors, adductors, all of those things want to be moving. And now you encase them and you clomp along with your heel striking and, going down the road. And your feet, the muscles of your feet literally atrophy to the point that now you're putting all of that burden of your running from the ankles up to the knees, up through the hips and the lower back. And those are the areas that tend to wind up getting injured as a result of this overlooking the most important and critical part of your gait, which is your foot strength and your foot health.
I just love that we're talking about this because I have so many women that are new to weight training, or they're interested in upping their weight training game, growing their glutes, growing their hamstrings, growing their quads, like developing that sort of quad sweep, if you will. And so many women complain about this. I can't feel my glutes. Like it doesn't matter. I can squat, I can lunge, I can definitely feel my quads working, but can't feel the glutes working. And I think that one of the missing components, of course, is exactly what you're talking about, is this freedom, if you will, for that great toe to be able to abduct and adduct and to be able to plantar and dorsiflex, so like point down and point up during that natural gait cycle. And then, of course, when you are training, when you're actually doing the resistance training at the gym, that is exactly, I do exactly that. I wear my shoes to the gym because, outside it's kind of dirty and gross, but then I get in the gym and my shoes are off. I haven't done barefoot. I think I've tried it once and I got a couple of like hairy eyeballs from people. So I do it in my socks, but I'm essentially barefoot with, like a sock covering or whatever. And I can very, very easily see a huge difference in my ability to activate glute max, as you were saying, when the toe is free to point, like when it's free to point downward.
Yeah, you literally think about pressing down through the great toe when you're doing like hip flexors, right? Those, the new piece of gym equipment that has come on the scene recently, that you're just doing hip thrusters.
The thrusts,
hip thrusters, yeah.
Yeah, great.
And I've seen people now, and I'm coaching people in the gym to do exactly that. Splay the toes outwardly as much as possible, and then on the thrust upward, just press into that great toe. And people are going, oh my God, I feel it for the first time. It's like, it's there, And, you're aware of my new shoe company, right? Palooza?
I have a pair. Yes,
okay,
I love
good.
them. Yeah,
good.
Palooza.
So I'm getting a lot of bodybuilders who will, they'll report back, oh my God, on leg days, I literally intuitively feel like I'm gauging 20% of my entire posterior chain just due to the fact that I'm able to abduct that great toe and splay those toes outwardly and screw the foot into the ground that way.
Yes. Yeah. And even just to pronate a little bit, I know we've been taught, even I was taught in chiropractic school, like pronation is absolute, like pes planus. Like if you have someone who has like, like a diagnosis of like totally flat feet, no arch, like that's the worst possible thing that you could ever see. And I totally disagree. I actually think that pronating a little bit, especially when we're talking about the squats, the lunges, or the lower leg activation is actually very important. Like that rolling into the great toe is really important.